Thank you so much for joining us on our series of award-winning educators talking through narratives of failure and hope. Today, we have a wonderful guest, Dr. Birgit Madelung, who is an educational developer and helper, supporter of teaching and learning, the Southern Denmark University. It is a great pleasure to join us across time zones as we talk to Birgit, who is working for the University Center for Teaching and Learning at Southern Denmark University. And her journey itself has been one that has gathered insights and knowledge from various spheres. Her master's degree is in English and International Development Studies from the University of Ohio. Her PhD is in history at the Southern Denmark University. And her role in teaching and learning in universities was sort of inspired when she was an assistant professor, and she participated in a lecturer training program and has been working in this field of support, design, and delivery since 2009. So Birgit helps faculty with exploring and excavating learning objectives, the planning of teaching and innovation, as well as study management and the organizational anchoring of pedagogical practice. She also helps with curriculum and program design and works with faculty from across the disciplines and silos of our institutional structures, including on a bachelor program of integrated design of engineering. So from history to English to international studies, now to engineering, we have such a broad skill set to talk about the pandemic, teaching and learning, and the role of higher education in Denmark, but also internationally. So Birgit, thank you so much for joining us today.
Well, thank you very much for having me. It's a pleasure.
So this just sounds like such an incredible journey and an adventure across, sort of international spheres. Can you tell us a little bit about your story and how you got to where you are now?
Yeah, I mean, in many things, no idea that I was going to do, for instance, a PhD. And actually, when I graduated from Ohio University, I actually had plans to go teach English in India, of all places. So that was sort of the initial idea. But I also knew, because it was sort of more on a voluntary basis, so I would have to go back to Denmark and try to earn some money. So I thought, okay, I'll go back and then I'll just take whatever job I can. And then I was offered a position teaching American history at the University of Southern Denmark. And this, of course, a few years younger than me, because I had just graduated, right? But I think just the experience of being with young people and having that experience of seeing them progress, of developing, of entering the classroom without really knowing anything perhaps about the subject. Of course, they choose a specific program, but there's so many things that the students do not know. And opening, for instance, in my case, the field of history to the students, I thought it was an amazing experience. And then it was suggested to me that I apply for a PhD, and so I did, which was really hard work. I continued teaching, and of course, then I did my research. I went to the States again to do my research. I did my PhD on the Vietnam Veterans Memorial. So I've been working with the history of memory, which is quite interesting, because this was, as I have to say, it was all about dead people, right? But then, and this is the major shift, that I realized that I really wanted to work with people here and now. So, but I actually continued in academia and continued on to be an assistant professor at the Copenhagen Business School, teaching American history and culture, immensely enjoying the teaching part. And this is when I did my lecture training program. And here I realized that I was not much of a researcher in history, actually. There was no energy in it for me. But where I got my energy from was from teaching, because I really loved, and this is in around 2005. And the whole sort of aspects of teaching and learning had not really developed. I mean, I was in a lecture training program, but much of the effort was really my own because I took a keen interest in it. So I just realized that I had to do something in order to have more possibilities of teaching. So I actually left my position as an assistant professor, which is, I don't think that common actually, because it's always hard to get an academic position. And then I had to do different things, and then I did the most of a master program in learning processes. I decided not to do the thesis because I had already done two, and I had my PhD, and I thought, I don't need to prove myself in that sense. So it was more about, learning, much more about learning theory, processes, learning processes, etc. And then by chance, just being very lucky, I actually got to the University of Southern Denmark because Rie was, as you know her, she was going on maternity leave. And I just made the right phone call at the right time. So speaking of hope, sometimes you just think, okay, I'm going to call this person, and then it actually ended up in a job or a maternity leave position. But then eventually I got a permanent position. I've been to other universities and university colleges also working. I've been a leader at one point, but I always return back to University of Southern Denmark. And I think it has something to do with the way we work together. So I think that's part of it too. So this is really how I got here. So when I look back, I think that teaching, and I also when I was preparing for this, starting thinking about it, I thought, I always took the opportunity as a student when teachers asked, does anyone want to do this next session? I thought, oh yes, I'll do it. So in that sense, I think I just always enjoyed being in the classroom, and I like the interaction. And I think that when I did my lecture training program, and especially when I did these further studies at this master program, I realized that there is so much more to teaching, because I also realized that I did a lot of lecturing. When I think back, I did some activities, but boy, I have learned so much more in these past 10, 12 years, really, and how much you can do with teaching. And I think I just find it very rewarding to teach because of the interaction. Yes. Mm-hmm. So this is really how I got here. Yeah.
That's fantastic. Thanks, Birgitte, for sharing your story with us. I just want to go down sort of one of the threads of your story, and it's sort of the thread about the reward or the joy that you find, within the myriad of opportunities, right? So what do you think it is that's made you seek out these opportunities? It seems like you have a love for teaching and learning. You find joy in developing, students or seeing them improve. What can you speak to that a little bit more?
I think first of all, I think it's this aspect of curiosity. And I think that we can both develop, but we can also kill curiosity with students. And I think this aspect, and of course also as an educational developer now, because now I teach teachers rather than teaching students, but this aspect or this perspective or opportunity to actually feed or encourage curiosity. And sometimes I wonder, how is it that we actually do it, of actually creating that curiosity? But I think to me, it's very relational. To me, having relationships with, or relation rather, with the assistant professors that we supervise, because we supervise them individually in the lecture training program. And actually having that experience of having a rather new teacher, and through supervision, through discussion, through dialogue, and actually seeing them develop is extremely rewarding to me. And I enjoy the fact that some teachers start almost from scratch. You know, I had a few teachers, I almost have to turn them away from the blackboard, right? because they're uncomfortable in the classroom. So the development is different from person to person. I like the fact that I don't want to make, you know, either the students or teachers the same, but I like the fact that they're developing on their own terms, on their own pace. Some just thrive in the classroom, and I think I learn from each encounter, but some are just excellent teachers. And of course, our conversations are so much different from teachers that are uncomfortable in the teaching situation, but both are extremely rewarding. So I think, yeah. So I think it's the relationship. And I think that's also why COVID, I know maybe it's jumping in questions, but to me, that was so challenging because I find it very, very difficult to create a relation online. I think a situation that we're in now works well. It's a dialogue, but when you're sort of trying to develop and sensing what is going on, I think it's so much more difficult online. So yeah.
And Birgit, I think that's absolutely right, that building trusting relationships where people can be vulnerable and be willing to transform together is something that requires, you know, a really, really important trust framework where you can do that in three-dimensional ways that makes it a little bit more challenging or difficult to do it in the two-dimensional because, you know, for so many different confounding factors, including like how our brains work and how we build relationships and pick up different kinds of signals and do that. And so I love that those insights, and I'm really interested in this sort of individualized mentorship that you build with especially junior faculty members through trust and through relationships and through their own transformation, right, over time. And I'm struck with the notion of how you manage failure as a learner yourself, taking and occupying a learner position, but how you also manage the kind of emotional energy necessary to work with your junior supervisees through their failures, through their both perceived failures and sometimes actual and measurable failures. Could you talk about how to sort of manage the difficulty both as the mentor, but also as a learner yourself?
Yeah, I've been thinking a lot about this aspect of failure. And I thought, when have I actually experienced that I have failed? And in many ways, I think I've failed many times. But I think, and it's not to say because I definitely failed, there's no doubt about that. But I think it's just, and I can sort of recall, you know, the sense of failure, of, you know, you can feel it physically in your body, and you're thinking, oh, this is terrible, and you've been in the classroom or whatever. But I think that somehow I just always found it important to say that failures are just something that we need to learn from. And I really try to encourage that also in our junior staff, or junior faculty rather, because I'm always trying to tell them that I'm not here to tell you whether you are a good or a bad teacher. I'm here because I want you to develop as a teacher. And I think the best way to compare it, when I was teaching at Copenhagen Business School, I had 2 classes of 30 students in each group. That's when we had money. Now it's just one group of 60, right? But we could actually teach 2 classes, but it's still a big class. And I had one on Tuesday, I think, and one on group on Wednesday. And, you know, the number of students were the same. They were in the same year in the program. The room was probably also the same. But, and of course, the content and the way I had organized the teaching sessions were the same. But the teaching, how it all sort of materialized was so different because the two groups were so different. And I think I sort of brought that's been quite a lesson for me, because I recall how nervous I was, for instance, when I was being supervised. You know, I knew I had my supervisor come into the teaching, and I thought, oh my goodness, I'm being watched, you know, she's going to grade me and etc. But I think from having that comparison was actually quite helpful for me, because I could sort of tell myself that there's always, I think the word in English is also resonance. I mean, that whatever happens in the room is not, it's not just me that's responsible for it. Of course, as a young teacher, I felt extremely responsible. But I think that experience taught me that whenever I reflect on my teaching, I always have to think about what took place in the room, and that's sort of the relationship between me and the students. And of course, you reflect on whether it was, did I do my best? But it sort of allowed me to think, okay, I'm not completely responsible for it, because there are always so many factors at play. And I think that's also why teaching is so interesting. But at the same time, it makes it difficult to develop teaching and develop teachers, because so many parameters are at stake. Also during COVID, if Zoom did not work, you could not teach, right? So there are many ways to fail. So I think it's important as a teacher, when you reflect, that you sort of allow yourself to step back and say, okay, what are the parameters that influence today's teaching? And sometimes you realize, well, the way I gave this assignment, it was not clear to the students. Fine, okay. You can sort of say, oh, I was almost going to swear now, but you can say, oh, what a shame. But then next time around, I know that I have to be more clear about the assignment. So it's not to say that I think I probably see failure as something to learn from, sort of in a general perspective, which doesn't mean that I have not left, a work situation or where I didn't sort of feel failure immediately. But then I sort of tell myself, you need to breathe, and you need to start thinking about it tomorrow. So I think that makes a difference. And I really try to, when I work with teachers, to let them know that this is not about finding failure. I'm not going to identify lots of failures, but I'm going to have a dialogue about your teaching. And then sometimes, they discover saying, maybe if I did this in another way, then it would work better next time. So I think I always try to, I don't want to avoid talking about failure, but I don't want to sort of pinpoint, this and this you need to do differently, because to me, it's still a development. So it's something that we progress over time. And of course, if it's something that continues, then maybe you have to have a very direct conversation about it. But I think it takes patience to not sort of pinpoint to failure. Mm-hmm. I had a very interesting conversation with an assistant professor in the lecture training program, and I'd observed her in her teaching, and then we had a follow-up conversation. And sort of halfway through the conversation, she said, it's so amazing to have a conversation about progression, about my teaching in such a relaxed manner, because she was used to, from her academic work, that it was all about, when she went to conferences, it was all about pinpointing failures in the research, in the development of her argument, etc. And I actually often think back to that thing, okay, this is actually something that I need to be aware of, because how do we develop? I think she would probably develop better as a researcher with a different type of feedback, if you could put it that way. Yeah.
I think that's critically important, right? The context and how we contextualize all of this is paramount, right? Because, obviously none of us are the teacher, the instructor, the learner that we were 20 years ago. And none of us could have foreseen this global pandemic, when now it's like, I have to use technology all the time. And if Zoom crashes, it's not my fault. And that's true, right? So I guess for me, it's a bit of a follow-up question. How do you see your own growth in relation to failure from, I'm not much older than my students, and I take failure as like, what am I going to do, to now when you're actively critically reflecting with colleagues and you're helping them grow. So you've become this educational leader who's trying to help others contextualize failure or vulnerability or resilience or whatever concepts you like.
Well, I think it's and of course that's hard for younger teachers, but I think it's also about experience and age, possibly also, right? But I think that that experience allows you to be less vulnerable, because you know that, okay, this was not a good teaching session, but you can improve it, you can learn from it. And I think that's yeah, experience is quite key. But I would still argue the way that we then, as an institution, support our teachers, and of course this is also what I'm very interested in, is how we institutionalize pedagogical thinking and pedagogical approaches, and thinking about pedagogical development, etc. Because I think if teachers, if they feel too alone in their work of actually having to carry out the teaching on their own without having any type of support, and it's both support in terms of course a lecture training program or supervision, etc., but it's also knowing that the dean's office or the head of studies, etc., support teaching, the way we talk about teaching, the role of teaching, I think is quite key to supporting handling vulnerability, because you are actually quite vulnerable when you are a teacher. Because it's I know you talked, Jessica, about Shakespeare, right? And that's I don't quite want to compare it to a stage, but still, you are it. When I was at Copenhagen Business School, because I worked with the history of memory and the use of places and etc. And at one point, one morning, I just got into the classroom and I sat down just among the students, and nothing happened. So after 10 minutes, I got up and I said, what's going on here? And they said, well, you're the teacher, so you're supposed to tell us what we are supposed to do. And of course it was about, because they've been working on an article with different how rooms or settings in a city were used in different ways in the 1800s. But the idea is, and I think that sort of demonstrates it, how much influence you have as a teacher. You actually frame the teaching. And I think in a Danish context, and I don't know, Pat, if you remember your school here, but as a teacher in a Danish setting, you don't have the authority, as I experienced when I was a student at Ohio University, for instance. It's not that we don't have, leverage in the classroom, but the students are much more independent. They don't have to show up for class. they can walk out in the middle of the class if they want to, because they're not interested, or they have to leave early, or so the authority is different in a Danish context. Authority comes from building relations, actually. That I'm very keen on Vincent Tinto's work about creating a sense of belonging, and this aspect of that when you experience that you belong somewhere, then the way your mind works, I think, opens up to learning in a different way. So I think this aspect of creating relations, and I think I've been discussing this with lots of teachers, and they say, well, I have 120 students in my room. And then I still argue with them and try to work with them, saying, well, you can actually still create relations with your students. You don't know their name, but you can still recognize their contributions in different ways, for instance. So I don't even know if I'm sidetracking now. What was the question?
You're perfect. Well, and what you're doing is you're giving us a roadmap for a systems and design approach to creating systems and policies and structures that value teaching and value learning. So you've just given us a whole list of, or a sort of guide about what you would build into Hope University, right? So these ecosystems where people are not isolated, that there is more support formally with mentorship, supervision, and training, but also that you create relationship-rich environments. And I borrow that term from Peter Felton's recent book on relationship-rich, that is both informal and formal clusters for people to feel connected and feel like they're belonging, so that they can be vulnerable enough to open themselves up for transformation. You just gave us this beautiful overview of what that would look like. And of course, you did it well citing Shakespeare. So my question to you is, as we build Hope University, and my premise here in Hope University is that what we say we do as universities and what we actually do, there's a gap there, and that gap is threatening to widen. And I think we're at a sort of critical and urgent place where we need to think about our systems, structures, and policies that we have in place to foster the things that you've just talked about, which is curiosity, right? Which is a deep engagement in learning together, and a focus on process rather than on product. And, you know, I quote in this book on Hope University that it is about the systems, not about the individuals, that we ask the individuals to do things in deteriorating conditions. And of course, Shakespeare gave us the sort of key here. And he said, something is rotten in the state of Denmark. Right? It's not Hamlet's fault that he can't make up his mind. It's not Hamlet's fault that he can't make an informed decision. He cannot access the appropriate knowledge necessary to move forward with his plan, whatever that plan is. So my question is something rotten in the state of Denmark? Higher education can swap in, or Danish higher education. And then if that's the case, where do we find and locate and take that rot out, and what do we replace it with so that it is not rotten anymore, that our individuals can flourish in systems that are resilient so that they don't have to be?
Boy, now I can talk for 2 hours, I think, because, well, I think something is rotten in the state of Denmark, in the sense that it's always to say, do the government need to send more money? I think, yeah, I mean, it's in the sense that we can always use more money, but I think we also need to consider how we spend the money. So to speak, in higher education. There's no doubt that the pressure on some of our programs, perhaps especially in the humanities, as I think it is in many countries, because, for instance, the technical faculty, and I think the faculty of health, they have more external support or external funding, right? But it's not just about money, but I think it's also about regulation. we live in a highly regulated society here, which helped us through COVID. So thank you for that. But there are so many regulations to the way we can conduct the programs. And I think because there are very strict, I don't know how it is in Canada and the United States now, but when I was a student at Ohio University, I could sort of look in the course catalog, and then I would show up for a class, and then the teacher had designed the course as he or she found best. You know, the type of exams, midterms, papers, exercises, whatever. But here in Denmark, of course, the teacher still has an influence, but we have very strict study guides. So, and they can only be changed sort of annually. So that means if you are a teacher and you have a great idea about how you want to conduct your program, your course, then you can't, because the study regulations, the study guide tells you that it's this type of exam. The students, you cannot ask the students to hand in, you know, an additional paper because it's not in the study guide. And for me as a teacher, it was extremely frustrating. And I think it's also frustrating when I work with teachers. They have great ideas. You know, they would like to do this, this, and this, but they can't do it because it's not in the study guide. And I think that's one of the major sort of institutional, what's the word for that? Sort of influences or something that halts development. I wish that we could sort of lighten up or ease that rather strict rule, because it kills innovative practices, and I think that's that's a sort of a major flaw. That's the rotten part about the educational system, and of course we are challenged by funding, because all of a sudden you have 60 students in the classroom rather than 25 or 30 students. But I think we can deal with that. As educational developers, we can help developing teaching that also supports large classes, because we always had large classes. But what we want to avoid is, of course, that they lecture for 2 by 45 minutes each week. We want them to create or practice active learning, right? With the students actually being active. But then it can be difficult because the students will look to the study regulations saying, no, I'm not supposed to turn anything in. I'm just supposed to be here for the exam. Yeah.
And I think this is also where we run into probably in Denmark, certainly in Canada, we run into things like academic freedom, right? And we run into the way that research is prioritized over teaching and learning in the job description of individuals, right? Where it's sort of like, I'm encouraged to innovate. I'm encouraged to think outside of the box in my research, but in the teaching, I'm told I have to stay in the box, right? And I stay in the box not because it's the best thing ever, but because it's how it's always been done, right? Like the teaching and learning. So I guess the question that I'd like to ask you, Birgitte, is really about how did COVID throw all that out the window, right? Sort of, I mean, things had to change because the modalities had to change because places got locked down and we had to go online. So how does a global pandemic change things, present new challenges, present new opportunities, and where do we hope we're going in 2023 post-pandemic?
Yeah. Well, certainly we also, of course, have e-learning educational experts in our center, and what I found interesting and perhaps also a bit disturbing, really, was when COVID hit, all focus was placed on the e-learning aspect. And of course, it was because, how did the teachers actually know how Zoom worked or Teams worked, etc. And I sort of tried several times to raise my hand and said, maybe we could also support the teachers in developing teaching activities that the students could do at home. So it wouldn't have to be just meetings on Zoom, because there were lots of teaching was saying, okay, then it's the teacher talking. Then we learned how to use the breakout rooms, etc. after a few months, etc. But I actually found it quite interesting, at least in a Danish context, how fast we were to sort of accept the idea that it was Zoom or nothing. That at least that's the first lockdown here, I sort of had that sense. And I actually got rather frustrated because I sort of felt that my head was bubbling with ideas that we could ask teachers to develop for the students to do at home or in smaller groups. And of course, you know, some, they actually created these groups where you knew that you only saw these 4 people, and some of the students could have done that. So in many ways, I think that COVID and the lockdown initiated new ways to think about teaching. And also this aspect of, okay, I could actually record this lecture and then the students can see it, and then we can do something else together in the classroom. So that was definitely an opening. But I was still also quite sort of puzzled by the fact how so many just thought, okay, we'll just teach on Zoom, and if the teacher is not present, then it's not teaching. And I'm thinking, oh, here is really an opportunity to think outside the box and actually consider how important it is. I always think of teaching as before, in, and after. So how do we support the students in preparing before we meet in the classroom or on Zoom for that matter? And then what do they do afterwards? And how is it linked to what we do the following week? So that we think progression with the students, so that the teacher's role is very much about framing sort of a path, so to speak, and then the students develop their learning strategies. Sort
of facilitating the conversation versus being the conversation. And when folks were looking for Zoom, they were looking at, I need to replace the classroom with Zoom, not looking to how can I augment, how can I make it even better by saying you can get the content over here and the class will take you 12 miles further down the road.
For instance, but I think in still in that sense, I do see sort of broadened perspectives on teaching. And one thing I realized was that many of our teachers, they realized if you are to teach on Zoom, and I also realized this myself, you have to be much more detailed in your planning. So teachers started to think more about, you know, in a sense, also activities. What was significant? Because if you have to do a lecture online, you have to be quite to the point. Where in the classroom you can sort of you are perhaps a little bit more sort of, and then you go off, and then you come back to what you initially wanted to say. So I think the issue of planning has become much more clear to teachers, saying, okay, there is actually a point in considering different activities. Thinking about myself, well, what do I, why do I do this activity? So that there is alignment between learning objectives and a learning activity that you create, right? Yeah.
So Birgit, I love this, and I wonder if we can capture this word alignment that you just brought in, because I think we have seen broader perspectives in teaching around modality and platform, and an increased awareness of the importance of alignment in our classrooms. Your son just went down.
Yeah,
I love that. We just saw the change of time in real life.
Yeah.
And I just wonder, because in Canada, we have a pretty specific way of evaluating and promoting professors. So we call it promotion, evaluation, and review. Professors go in at the assistant level, associate level, and full professor level, and they're assessed based on, depending on the institution, service, teaching and research. And one of the problems in our promotion, evaluation, and review is that we don't, for the most part, value teaching in promotion, especially from associate to full professor. So what we say we do, which is, part of our mandate as higher education, is to, equip citizens to go out into the world and make it better and more democratic and more just. But we don't actually value that kind of work activity and critical reflection in our assessment of faculty. And I wonder if you could speak to that from the Danish perspective, if there's something rotten in the state of Denmark, and then how we could imagine alignment of valuing the kind of work that you've suggested: vulnerability, informal and formal, relational ecosystems, and senses of belonging. How do we take that into consideration when we review and evaluate and promote our faculty?
Well, I think it's really a tremendous challenge, because it's really changing a culture, right? Because I we were all evaluated on our academic work, our PhD, the number of publications we did as an assistant professor, etc. I think there's not an easy answer to it, because I think it's about institutional thinking, really. It's about that the whole way the institution thinks about teaching must be sort of integrated in the sense that, and it's not just about evaluating, for instance, the teaching portfolio when you go to your interview for a position. I think that's part of it, and maybe that's the first sort of stepping stone in terms of that you're recognized when you are hired. You're recognized for your teaching as well. But I think the whole system needs to support teaching, and it's a way that the study guides. It's the way that heads of studies, how are they sort of, I don't know if that's the word, but equipped pedagogically. And with all respect for my colleagues at SDU, I'm also a bit concerned about how well they actually understand educational development. Sometimes I think it would be interesting to have educational developers as head of studies. Of course, then there is the aspect of the academic part of it, but I often see that heads of studies, they become administrators, and at the various meetings, they look at, well, how many students did not take the exams, did everybody do an evaluation? So it becomes sort of very much a sort of quantitative rather than sort of a qualitative approach to thinking about teaching and learning at the university. And admittedly, I'm just waiting for my book to be published on pedagogical competence development in higher education. And it's a handbook, and it is really for educational or heads of studies, not so much educational developers, but those that are responsible, saying, well, how do I actually go about this? And it is a handbook, so it's not sort of heavily academic in its sense, but it very much embraces the systemic thinking. That is, that everything is sort of interrelated, and that the individual teacher is very much dependent on the decisions that are made at the various levels. And if I was to be very critical, I could go through probably any Danish university and say, well, what decisions are actually made at the various levels? Do our vice principals, how keen are they actually on teaching and learning? Do they ever talk about it? If I look at some universities and I'm saying, well, what are their sort of the vision? And often there is a vision about, perhaps something about it's an educational institution, etc. But then when you sort of go through, what they do, it's very much about academic life. In terms of research, I should rather use that word, right? So I think it requires a development of the various hubs and a recognition. It actually requires from the very top. I'm a very much a bottom up approach person, but I do see that it needs to be recognized at the very top of the university. I'm curious about how many boards at universities actually discuss teaching. I think they more discuss funding and research, etc. Yeah, and I think we have in Denmark. We also, as perhaps also in other countries, of course, we have sort of a national teaching award, and each university points out a few or two candidates from each university, and then there is a national group that votes, and then one is voted for. And I think it of course it draws attention to teaching, but it also it tells the new teacher, look at how good you have to be, because it's the crème de la crème, right? It's the best you can ever find, which is wonderful, I think, in many ways. But the large majority of teachers perhaps do not have the opportunities as this one teacher has had. And again, I think, a teacher that develops within his or her assistant professorship, actually, being able to move away from the blackboard and ending up feeling comfortable in the classroom, actually starts doing different activities with the students, start to think about the curriculum, the content, etc. I think it has so much more, I think deserves an award because that development is so much harder. And speaking of failure and vulnerability, I think we really have to give credit to those that I would say truly develops, because if you are an excellent teacher, it's always easier to become better, right? Because your vulnerability is just so much, is perhaps almost not present, right? Because you just know you nailed it, and you can do better. And that's, of course, they are role models, of course, but I'm not quite always sure they're the right role model, because as a young teacher, I would feel so much more vulnerable with saying, okay, I'm supposed to do this, rather than developing on my own terms. And I think this aspect of understanding that teachers are different, and they thrive differently in the classroom. We have to recognize that. So I don't want all teachers to do the same, because they are individual people, and they develop in their own pace. But I still think we have to place demands on teachers, so that the institution is also clear about what they expect. Yeah, and I think that's sometimes difficult in the Danish setting, to actually have, when you do something in a department, for instance, maybe only a third shows up, or some kind of educational development activity. So yeah,
I think I completely agree with all of what you've just said, Birgitte. Like the culture change, the top to bottom, the shift that's required, and I guess, when I look at it in my new position as a dean, right, it's about role modeling, and it's about providing some, you could get here to this level or whatever, but it's not about standardization. All it is about, here are some options, some promising practices. They may not be the best practices for you, but here's a safe space for you to have those conversations, for you to be involved in that. Maybe it's with like-minded folks, all emerging, early career researchers or early career teachers, or maybe it's with a series of mentors or not. But that's beside the point. What I wanted to come back around to was, in terms of teaching and learning, you're obviously very passionate about teaching and learning, and have all kinds of insights. What is the one thing that sort of like gets you out of bed in the morning. You're so excited to go and work on around teaching and learning? Or on the flip side, what is it that sort of, keeps you up at night, that just irks you and makes you want to like make a change? Maybe they're the same thing. Who knows?
Well, tomorrow, I think I probably do this course 6 times a year now, but I teach our PhD students because they have teaching obligations in their PhD programs. So we created this 2-day course for them. And I always, it's always such a thrill to teach them because even though they are vulnerable, they also curious. I have once in a while, there are some that, because for some it's mandatory and they're like, well, I was supposed to do research and I don't really want to do this teaching, etc. But then, most of them actually, they warm up. And I think it's, I'm always excited when I do that course. They always send me their challenges beforehand. So I look through them and then we sort of integrate it in the course so that we address some of these issues that they bring up. And I'm always amazed at how some of them are very new. And you can almost read the vulnerability between the lines in a sense. But they're quite reflected already. Just the fact that I asked them and then they say, what is it about my teaching I actually find challenging? So they're not afraid to share those challenges. And I think that is quite helpful in terms of, in a sense, indirectly addressing vulnerability, that it's okay, that we really want them to address these issues. And it's something that we can work with. And some of them, they think, okay, I do this 2-day course and then I'm a teacher. But of course, we also then, of course, address that they're just entering that interesting road of life of teaching. And to some, I actually had a colleague when I was an assistant professor. We had a PhD student come in, and I was in charge of the teaching part, of distributing teachers, etc. And I asked him to do a specific course, and then he resigned because he was so afraid of teaching. And I've often thought back to that story because I was simply not, at that point in my career, I was not aware of what was going on. But we should have definitely taken him under our wings and said, it's okay, you can come teach with us and then we'll help you through, right? But then there's a system, you have to teach on your own. But I think we could have perhaps created a good teacher out of him. So that was a lesson. That was a failure that I had to recognize many years later. Yeah. So yeah, was that an answer, Pat?
That was a wonderful answer. And it beautifully leads into my final question for you, which is back to your disciplinary or your interdisciplinary lens that you use to probably see the world, whether that's teaching or the ways in which we understand the huge and tremendous global instability right now, which is the notion of memory and history and international studies. And you mentioned that some of your doctoral work was on the Vietnam Memorial and about dead people and about sitting in the grief of memory, and how memory is really important. To memorialize something is to remember something with the intention. Sometimes historians often say that history will not repeat itself, or it will not allow it to be repeated, because we have this lens through which we can understand our past in order to reflect on our present, in order to innovate our future. So I'm really curious about whether or not, looking back to history, sitting in the discomfort of grief and watching the world unfold as it is unfolding right now, and in many ways having a kind of World War II repeat, or having some of the same things happen. Even the speeches that current leaders are using, they're quoting Churchill and Shakespeare and a number of other thinkers. Where are you right now on the spectrum of despair to hope with our relationship to history, to memory, and to grief?
Well, I think I was born hopeful. I mean, in many ways, when I woke up on February 24th, as everybody else, I was quite shocked. I mean, of course, referring back to the Ukrainian situation. But then I go to work and I see the students walking down the hallway. I see teachers still developing their courses. I have seen a tremendous change from when I started in 2009 doing this work. Of course, I've been teaching before that, and to where we are at now. And actually, I think even though I'm quite still critical of some of the ways we dealt with the teaching situation right when we locked down, I still think that we have learned a lot from this crisis. And in that sense, I think that failure is also that is also part of us as human beings. And these are very big questions, right? Because the question is, have we learned anything from World War II? And in so many ways, I would actually say I'm utterly concerned about the current situation. But I also think it's interesting that our current leaders across the world, or more or less across the world, do make references back to some that had quite significant ideas about the world and about the future of the world in the realm of World War II. This, of course, does not mean that we don't have other leaders that can create havoc and a third world war situation. But I'm quite curious about the responses to the situation. I don't know how it is in Canada, but here the Ukrainian flag has flown in many different places, and we have very, very strict rules about the flag here. But it was actually allowed for a foreign flag to be flown from also private businesses, etc. And I also, I think one of the reasons why I wrote the book that I just written and will come out here in May, I guess, or that's actually the plan, was because I am hopeful, because I think there are ideas to create better universities, to place greater emphasis on teaching, to have the institution not just think about research, but about teaching as well. And this is what makes me get up in the morning. What makes me that I can't fall asleep at night is because it's so slow. Change is so slow, right? And I get impatient, and I do have days where I'm thinking, I'm going to quit my job now. I want to go out into the private sector. I want to work in a small business because I'm sure they have no problems of this kind. And then I realized, well, that's probably not quite true, right? So I think it's because I do see change. I see, hopefully tomorrow afternoon, I see happy PhD students leaving, the room. They might, they come into the classroom like this. They're so worried. They're so vulnerable. And then their shoulders sort of, even out, and they feel so much more relaxed about having to teach perhaps next week or just before the summer, right? So I think in that sense, I think there's lots of hope, and I think that's the only way to approach this. It might, some people sometimes call me naive, but I say, thank you very much for calling me that, because I do believe that hope is actually quite significant. Hope is part of recognizing failure, because if you recognize failure, that means there's also hope to do things differently. And I think in many ways, I'm still curious about, for instance, how our younger generation, if they experience, if they can, if life becomes richer for them because they sort of experienced what they lost, so to speak, during the lockdown. But then, of course, much of the lockdown and what they experienced was also because they had expectations, which is quite interesting because I have a daughter who is 17 and she graduated from that's our primary school system. And so they didn't go to Berlin. They didn't go to have the final ball because we were in a lockdown. So it was also about the expectations that were not fulfilled. So I'm thinking that maybe we become better at not having. I think expectations is a driver for us, but maybe we expectations also makes us much more vulnerable in many ways, I think. So that I hope young people becomes better at living here and now, saying it is an uneasy world, but now then I have to do my best right now, rather than wait for 2 years or whatever, how we should put it. Yeah. So yeah, but I'm just very hopeful person. I can't help
well,
it.
I love that. And we chose the right profession because we're surrounded by young, thoughtful, insightful humans who are willing to sit in the complexity and difficulty and together imagine a world that is better than the one that we have. And if that is not the antidote to despair, if that is not the champion of democracy as a social institution, as a mandate of a publicly funded institution, I don't know what is. So thank you so much for joining us and for connecting the dots between the narratives of failure and hope and the ways in which we can trace those through memory and through senses of belonging and design thinking around how we can foster what it animates all of your interests, which is curiosity. So it's been a pleasure to have a conversation with you today.
Likewise from here.
Thanks so much, Birgitte.
You're most welcome.